So, I love to hear how you found the secular Buddhism in Japan. So, I mean, last year, so we invited you to Kyoto, and we had an intensive discussion, and also we had some pilgrimage around that, and you somehow rediscovered or so encountered Shinran tradition, a Pure Land tradition, who in a sense started. Yes, obviously he was one of the very important figure in secular Buddhism movement 800 years ago. So how was the meeting? How significant? How important was the meeting to you with Shinran?
Well, I think because of my secular upbringing, I was not raised. I never went to church. I was never raised. I had no Christian education, no religious education. I was raised as a secular humanist, and I felt, though, that at the end of, when I was, say, 18, 19 years old, I felt that I'd missed something, that something in my upbringing had not been adequate, that I didn't know what that was. And that, I think, is what drew me to Buddhism, because I wasn't drawn to Christianity or Judaism. But I was very fascinated by Buddhism. Why, I don't know. It was very popular at that time as well, in the 1960s. But nonetheless, I ended up with Buddhists. But once I'd somehow gained, a basic understanding of Buddhist philosophy and practice, I then began to recognize that there was a lot of this stuff that I didn't really appreciate. All the religious rituals, a lot of the dogmatic beliefs. And so, although I was drawn to religion, that doesn't mean that I somehow lost my secular roots. In fact, my secular roots remain very strong. And I was struck by how in Buddhist teaching, there are some things that I was taught by my Tibetan teachers, which had nothing to do with religious belief. It had to do with human existence, like meditation on death. The time of, it's certain that you'll die, it's uncertain when. That is just a fact. It's nothing to do with being Buddhist or anything. It's fairly obvious. And yet there are other Buddhist teachings that have nothing whatsoever to do with human existence. They have to do with the Buddhist worldview. So from a very early age, I started being more interested in those Buddhist figures from the past who spoke to my secular self, as it were. And there are a number of figures. One figure is Shantideva, who again has a strong secular bent. But also in Zen Buddhism, likewise, figures like Bodhidharma, for example, and others. But when I was in Japan last year and doing the pilgrimage around Shikoku Island, and then having our dialogues in Kyoto, and then also subsequently when I got back to my home in France, then I started reading a lot about Shinran. I read quite a lot of his own writings, in English translation, obviously. And then it became very clear to me that Shinran was someone who, again, experienced this secular move. And after his 20 years as a monk and all of those years on Mount Hiei, he comes down from the mountain, as it were, and he says, enough of all of this stuff. And, I can't practice religion. I'm just a foolish bombo. foolish person driven by blind passions. There's no monks, there's no laity, there's no men, no women, no all of these things. Now, this is an incredibly secular move. I don't think it's a mystical insight at all. I think it's an act and a recognition of profound honesty. He's actually willing to call out the Buddhist establishment and say, well, you speak about enlightenment all the time, but where are these enlightened people? Point one out to me. Where are they? Where are they? What's going on? Why do this stuff if nobody actually is somehow able to realize these elevated spiritual states? So Shinran struck me as someone who, even in the 13th century, which is a long time ago, suddenly woke up to this reality. I think in many ways he woke up to what Gautama, at his best, also was aware of. And there are passages in the Pali Canon in which you can get a glimpse of this rather more secular approach. But Shinran stood out really as someone closer to us in our time, admittedly from a very different culture than my own. But again, it triggered this sense that we need to be very careful about embracing religious hierarchies, in surrendering our authority or our autonomy to the authority of a priest or to a dogma or something. And because that can so easily somehow suck us into, in a way, giving away our own independence, our own freedom, and becoming a devotee of a particular teacher or tradition, and then gaining all sorts of benefits by being having a position and a rank. You have this wonderful expression of Rinzai, the true person of no rank. Right, you come across that? Yeah. That's a very secular statement. Yeah. The true person of no rank who's going in and out of your face all the time. And you have to see that. You have to just recognize this.
Yeah, so in Japanese, ichi mui no shinnin.
Oh, is that what it is? That's the true person of no rank, no status. And that, I think, is basically what Shinran embodied. He was a true person without any rank, without any status. And that, to me, is, I feel, a message not just for Japanese history or Chinese or Buddhist history, but I think that's a call for our own time. Here we have a recognition that in the heart of even the most ordinary person, and again Shinran, he says, my teaching is for the people the butchers and the people who make wine and all this stuff, and not for monks and spiritual people. And
so he declared, so I'm neither monk
or
nor
a lay person.
I guess a lay
exactly,
person.
Yeah. And that I find a very, very appealing idea. But I also realize that it's difficult to know how to translate that into a religious organization. If you make everybody the same, then nobody has any authority over anybody else.
Yeah.
And so there are issues involved, obviously. But again, it points once more, going back to another theme, the idea of a genuine democracy. In other words, where the power lies in the voice of the people. It doesn't lie in the voice of the most senior monk in the monastery. And this, I feel, is not a trivial point. And I think it somehow exposes what is often a conceit or an arrogance even amongst people who claim religious authority. Is that it's a sort of showmanship. It's a play, it's a performance. Yet at the heart of that person's life, there is basically the same reality that you and I experience now. And so in a way it's a call towards a kind of spiritual honesty, a spiritual integrity, and it's also a recognition that, that every being is a Buddha, if you like, in classical Buddhist language. And you find this idea in Buddhism, but it's usually taken as a kind of mystical utterance, we're all Buddhas, sounds wonderful. But to actually take that idea seriously and to recognize that even in the most humble, ordinary person you meet at your workplace or on the street, therein lies a Buddha. And there you'll find, Shantideva is very good at this. He makes this point very clearly. And the true person of no rank, neither a monk nor a layperson. All of these ideas point towards the primacy of ordinariness rather than extraordinariness.
Right.
And I think we're losing my train of thought a little here. Where could I go from here? Have I missed something that you asked me?
No.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, let's leave it at that.
Yeah. So, I would say not only Japanese Buddhism, but the Japanese Buddhism, the Japanese traditional Buddhism, and the secular Buddhism in your context share. I would say share the common value, which appreciate the Buddhism in everyday life, right? And so I think it is very interesting that Japanese Buddhism in everyday life appreciate very much the connection with ancestors. Actually, many people assume that the Japanese Buddhist monks must practice meditation every day, and so their role in society is teaching mindfulness practice. But actually, in reality, so the monk's role is, I would say, nothing to do with these things, meditation or even Dharma teaching, I think. But is so the main role which is expected from the followers is taking care of ancestors, right? So how do you see this nature of Japanese Buddhism? I think so Japanese Buddhism is a Buddhism in everyday life, and the center of this Buddhism is taking care of ancestors. So how do you interpret this?
Well, can I just step back a little bit and make a comparison between the Buddhism that I've experienced primarily in the West or in Tibetan refugee communities in India. In both cases, I've not studied or learned the Buddhism I learned in both those instances was not actually embedded in the community around me. In Dharamsala, you have a bunch of Tibetans up in a little village in the hills, and the rest is just India. Or if I'm my Buddhist monastery in Switzerland, a lovely place overlooking the Lake of Geneva, but the neighbours, know nothing or have no interest whatsoever in Buddhism. Buddhism is basically concentrated in small, specialist communities surrounded by a great amount of indifference. So therefore, when you're exposed to Buddhism in that way, then you hear what the teachers say, and they're talking about practicing meditation, and they're talking about Dharma teaching and philosophy, and you think that's what Buddhism is. And in some ways, it's not entirely false. But because you have nothing else to compare it with, no other context in which to understand that, you think that that's kind of what it is. That's the whole thing. And what I found most liberating when I stayed for 4 years in South Korea in a Zen monastery is, for the first time, I experienced the practice of Buddhism not in an isolated place, but in embedded within the structure of a whole society. And the people who came to the monastery in Korea, some of them were shopkeepers, some of them were farmers, some of them were dropouts, some of them were, they had a crisis in their marriage. People became monks for millions of different reasons, not because, they had some spiritual yearning. That's actually quite rare. The monastery serves as for a whole range of people with all kinds of different reasons for being there. I thought of the monastery in those days as being like a microcosm of society itself, rather than the spiritual elite.
Right.
In the monastery. It's not like that. And that destroyed a lot of naive views that I had. And so when I was in Japan recently with you and others, again, that came to me very, very forcibly, that Buddhism was something that impregnated the whole society. As you call it, it was ambient. In other words, it's actually somehow in the very atmosphere, the very air you breathe has got a kind of a Buddhistic sort of flavour. The architecture, the art, the aesthetics, the way they wrap the food, everything.
Embedded in every corner of
life. And so I think a lot of Westerners go to a place like Japan and they say, but they don't do any meditation, or they look down on everyday Buddhism in Japan or in other Buddhist countries too. A lot of Westerners are disappointed when they go to, say, Burma or Thailand and find that most Thais and Buddhists, Thais and Vietnamese and so on, they don't take Buddhism as seriously as the Westerners do. Western converts tend to take Buddhism too seriously as a kind of spiritual discipline, as a very sophisticated philosophy, and they fail to recognize how it lives not just in monasteries, but it lives in the society all around, and it's full of flaws and disappointments and contradictions, but that's life. I mean, that's how Buddhism, any religion, operates within the confusions of the world, and that's not a problem. If it doesn't have that environment, it arguably becomes too detached from the world to really be able to engage with it in a meaningful way. And I think this is a problem in Buddhism. I think the move towards monasticism, which arguably started at the Buddha's time, the forming of a bhikkhu sangha, already somehow separated the Dharma from the life of ordinary people. I don't think Gautama intended it that way, and in fact there are early texts that suggest that he saw the community as very much equal. No matter what your status, you had an equal responsibility to teach and to study and so on. But in reality, Buddhism has become a church. It's become a religious institution. It has become a concentration of power and wealth. And as such, it very often loses touch with the lives of ordinary people. So in being with you in Japan, I could see that in some of the grandiose buildings and so on. But also, I was able to witness the practice of the Dharma in a completely informal way that was simply given in the kind of society Japan has become. That's not to say everything is perfect in Japan. It's no more perfect there than anywhere else. But nonetheless, you can see how Buddhism has somehow characterized many features of that society. And I hadn't thought of it so specifically in terms of ancestors before, but when we were doing the pilgrimage particularly, and later also in Kyoto, we spent a lot of time going to the shrines of the kami, for example, and recognizing that in all of these monasteries there are cemeteries, tombs, all of these things. You realize that that's a very central part of the Buddhist tradition. It's the same in Korea. Again, we as monks, we would spend a lot of time reciting prayers for people who had died. With a member of the congregation died, there'd be, quite a long, we spent a lot of attention on the needs of not obviously the dead person so much, but their family and their friends and others who'd come, for services and for so on. So I've never really thought that through, to be honest, and I don't quite know how that understanding would inflect what we might understand as a secular Buddhism. Secular tends to, the word secular suggests very much of this time, of this age. In other words, it's a call for Buddhist practice and teaching to address the concerns of our time. But in doing that, you might lose touch with the ancestral dimension.
Right.
Because you'd think, well, that's all in the past, and what we really, the real urgency is the present and the future. And that would be, I think, a big mistake. And a one that one could easily make, particularly as a Westerner who's interested in Buddhism, because you're just not exposed to that dimension, unless you go and live in Korea or Japan or somewhere. And that, I think, is probably crucial. If a secular Buddhism is to evolve, it cannot do so without holding a very clear awareness of its own past, and not just as a tradition, but as a community, a community that may no longer be, alive, in other words, physically alive, but let's say with my own, going back to my teacher Geshe Rabten, for example, he stood, as it were, as an intermediary between this world and a very distant world. I mean, he grew up in a world very difficult for me to imagine, in the early 20th century in Tibet. And so I think by holding to our hearts the examples of those figures who are older than us, our teachers, or whether we've known them or not, that allows us to retain that source of inspiration, that source of insight, that source of basic sort of good humanity that is embodied in these figures.
Yes.
So secular Buddhism cannot just ignore that. It has to, I think, in a way, open itself up to the wisdom and the generosity of the ancestors within that tradition. And without doing so, I don't think you'd really have the possibility of a real in-depth dialogue or discourse from beginning to really emerge. Because one of my favorite definitions of a living tradition, which comes from a Christian theologian actually, is that a living tradition is one that is always in a conversation with its past. So it's the conversation with the past is what makes the tradition alive for today.
Oh, yeah.
It's a very good definition, I think. It's from a man called Alistair MacIntyre, a philosopher. And so, the reason that I'm drawn back to the Buddha, I'm drawn back to Socrates, and I constantly recall Geshe Rabten and Leonard Krask and these people from the past, is not out of some nostalgia, but it's actually in order to keep that conversation going. Right. So I feel that although, I feel as though to engage with Socrates, I don't just read Plato and note down what he said. I find myself in a dialogue with Socrates, or in a dialogue with the Buddha, or with a dialogue with my teachers. And that's something, obviously, that goes on in my own imagination, but that doesn't make it any the less important.
So what you're saying completely, perfectly resonates with what I'm going to ask at the end of this podcast, right?
Okay.
So, so for Japanese people, temple is a place to meet their ancestors, to remember them, but at the same time, it's not just about remembering ancestors. So temple, in my observation, who have been Buddhist monk in Japan for 20 years. Temple is also a place to refresh your relationship with your ancestors, right? So everything is changing. So you need to refresh, renovate the relationship with your important people constantly, right? By having a conversation, right?
Exactly.
So, given this tradition, I think we can do the same thing, not only with our ancestors, but also with ideas from our ancestors. Okay, so that's why we do funerals, and sometimes we do some ceremonies like funerals for not only for people but for dolls or
Dolls?
doll
D-O-L-L.
or
Cats?
cameras, whatever. I mean, so whatever you are intimate, right? You feel intimacy. So we are surrounded by so many ideas, and I appreciate the ideas we have. We succeeded from our ancestors with respect, with deep respect, but some of them could be we need to leave some of them in our generation and not bringing ideas to next generation, right? So for example, GDP. So we received a big benefit from this measurement of economy, GDP, to improve our state of the world. But now it seems like so the GDP is no longer sufficient, effective to measure this word as a measurement of this word. So like this, if you have a funeral for any ideas
that need to be buried,
right. What is it?
Well, I think probably what I would want to bury is what Heidegger called the technologische Gestell. I mean, the technological frame in which we understand the world. And in other words, I think that since the European Enlightenment, through the Industrial Revolution, into modernity, human beings have come to see the enormous benefits of science and technology, and what like your GDP, very helpful. They raise people have greater access to wealth and devices and all of those kind of things. It's done an enormous amount of good for us. But in doing that, it has, I think, also transformed our minds in such a way that we start to see the whole of life as basically something that can be fixed by technological solutions. In other words, that the problem with technology as a way of life, as it were, is that we necessarily have to step back from what it is that is causing us, let's say, some suffering or other, in order to have the ability to then analyze what's wrong and then come up with a technological solution, a series of steps that we can put into place that will solve the problem, and the problem will then go away. A problem that is solved disappears. The problem's no longer there. And the way that we've come to view the world, and not just the world, but also ourselves and other people, is very often in that technological way of thinking. And a very good example of this is how Buddhist meditation is presented as a technology.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, that the Four Noble Truths are presented as a technological framework. You have a problem called suffering. You find out the cause of the problem, craving and ignorance. You have techniques to get rid of the ignorance, and then the problem is solved. It's a classical technological frame. So it's not just from modernity that we have inherited this idea of a technological framework. It's also there already in early Buddhism. We can see it. I think it's a deeply human tendency to adopt a strategy that appears to be able to grant you the ability to get rid of all your suffering, to solve all your problems, and get what you want.
Yeah.
And nowadays, I feel that technological way of thinking has so overdetermined the way in which human beings behave that we're losing touch with what some philosophers have called the mystery of the world. In other words, the world is no longer mysterious. The world is no longer a source of wonder and awe. The world is basically a set of problems that we can solve and a set of desirable experiences that we can have and enjoy. And the whole of, I think, modern industry, society is working on the basis of that kind of thinking. And I think the climate crisis too is very much the result of having treated the world basically as just an object for our technological control. And Heidegger, back in the 1950s, he saw this problem very, very clearly. He saw it as being a process that would eventually run out of control. We'd no longer be able to control the power of the technological worldview to dominate the earth. And he saw it as he was very, very, he had great despair as to what was awaiting humanity, long before we had the climate crisis or anything like that. But the climate crisis is very clearly a consequence of our having mastered certain technologies. But beneath the mastery of industrial technologies, lies the mindset that sees life in terms of problem solving by technological means, and thereby diminishing our capacity to be astonished and to wonder at the sheer fact that we're alive at all. And so birth, sickness, aging, death, which are the starting point of Buddhism, are not problems. They cannot be solved. They are mysteries because they are inseparable from whom we are. Buddhism tends to want to think that you have some sort of mind that goes on after death, and therefore your body is not a mystery, it's a problem.
So it is something which is very difficult to bury.
It's very difficult to bury because it is so integrated and permeating our whole consciousness.
Right.
But it's something that also does have its origins in our past, both the Western, technological developments in the Industrial Revolution. But as I said, also, the Buddhists have thought in that way too about how to get rid of suffering. Suffering, you make birth, sickness, aging, and death problems. You find a solution, end of problem.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is one of the great insights that I think we learn from Heidegger, but also other existentialist philosophers, another one being a man called Gabriel Marcel, who was working at the same time on very similar ideas. And I feel more and more what those philosophers were saying then, this is, 60, 70 years ago, is now coming to fruition. So that would be I know it's maybe an ambitious thing to bury, but I feel that it is so important in terms of our survival and the survival of others that we're liable to end up destroying the world we depend upon because of our technological obsessions.
Yeah, so at least we can start from being aware of it.
Yeah, so, no, that's the most difficult thing in a way, is to not only is to be aware of it, to notice it in how we behave, to notice it in how people around us behave, how our society behaves, how our government goes about its business and so on. And yet we don't notice it, you see, that's the problem. If we were more aware of it, and I also don't think we are aware of what we've lost by adopting this frame of the world. And I think it goes hand in hand with having moved away also from a more spiritual, religious sensibility, which doesn't consider things in that way. Religion, I think, has often been the one place where we can spend a day or a morning in the week, and we go to a church or we go to a temple, and we put ourselves into a totally new frame of mind. There's no room for technology in a temple or a church, or technological thinking. We're opening ourselves to the unknown. We're opening ourselves, whether we call it God or whether we call it the Buddha or whatever, it doesn't matter. But we're actually invited to let go of a certain mindset and enter briefly into another kind of participation with life itself.
Oh, I see. So yeah, I learned that. So if I want to bury something, the first thing I need to do is to make it visible.
Yeah, make it visible.
Otherwise, it exists it continues to exist like a ghost.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, great. So it's a very unique and profound answer. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Shankar.
For sharing your wonderful wisdom.
Well, I don't know how wonderful it is, but if it can be, little parts of it can be helpful to people, that's great. And
I'm sure.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.